comic books,
comic
book podcast.
we like
Comic books.
because they have no flow.
I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White. And as always, you can check us out on social media. We actually do have a Facebook page now. So at Boneless Comics Podcast is where you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel up as well. If you search "We Like Comics," we will probably not be the first result. So you may need to type in the entire thing, which I realize is not ideal, but there's a little bit of extra content on there. Some stuff that if we ever become popular, we may move to Patreon or something like that. But it's just kind of some fun extras. You guys can go check that out if you want to. And we're also on Twitter, of course, at Boneless Comics 1. So everybody check it out. And I think we have a lot of material to get through today, so let's go ahead and get into it. We're covering Venom Lethal Protector from 1993, which has the unique quality of being connected to the Spider-Man universe, which, Joe, is your favorite character at Marvel. So that's pretty cool, pretty exciting.
Yes, I'm always excited to be able to talk about anything related to Spider-Man. As we mentioned in our first episode, the intro episode, I got into Spider-Man by reading the essential volumes around when the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie came out in 2002. But before that, as a kid, I had watched a lot of Saturday morning cartoons, and there was this one animated Spider-Man series that aired from 1994 to 1998 that introduced me to pretty much all of Spidey's major villains, including Venom. I didn't realize it at the time, but this animated show was pretty comic accurate with just a few changed premises to fit into a solo show about Spider-Man. I remember seeing Venom and thinking Eddie Brock was kind of a jerk, and Venom was this crazy-looking monster that had Spider-Man's powers, but it wasn't until I started reading comics that I really got to know the character well. So, Mike, what was your first exposure to Venom? I assume it was the 90s cartoon as well?
Oddly enough, because I was, spending my $2.50 or whatever my allowance was as a kid at the comic book store very occasionally. There was one that was within walking distance of our house in Macomb, Illinois, which is where I lived when I was very young, up in central Illinois. And so I saw this cover with Venom on it that to me was one of the coolest covers I'd ever seen. It had this sort of holographic red foil sheen to it behind Venom with Mark Bagley's art on it. And that just very happened to be issue 1 of Venom Lethal Protector. So back in 1993, I would have been, 10 or 11 whenever this issue came out. And that would have been right before we met and developed our friendship, maybe about a year or so before that. So I had bought this issue. My dad was doing ministry at the Baptist Student Union at the time. And I was so struck by the cover art that what I did was I actually went home and I made it a point to look at it and try and make a copy of that drawing on a page. And this isn't tracing, but this is me kind of learning how to do more detailed drawing, draw those sharp teeth, draw the expression on his face, all of those things, just kind of trying to copy Bagley's art onto a page. And this has the distinction of being the very first piece of art that I ever sold to somebody, because I made this drawing of Venom, and there was one of the college students there at the Baptist Student Union in Macomb was like, hey, I'll give you $40 for that, which when I was 11 years old, I thought I was the richest person in the world, making $40 for a drawing. So that it's really cool because Lethal Protector actually has that, that memory for me, or that nostalgia of, I didn't really remember reading it at the time, but I just remember being so impressed with that cover art that I had to reproduce it. And again, it resulted in the first thing I ever sold. So
Wow.
yeah.
I didn't know that, but I do remember seeing As a kid, I do remember seeing you draw these kind of like almost grotesque figures with like the sharp teeth and the sharp claws, and I don't know, I just thought that was kind of your style. It was just like, well, you like to draw, angry, scary-looking creatures. Well, I mean, that's cool. You do it really well. So, but I had no idea that it stemmed from not only Venom but Lethal Protector. So that's pretty awesome.
This is pretty much the beginning of me drawing monsters, and a lot of it's very influential on my art style. So
Wow,
yeah.
I learned something today.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't think we had talked about that before, and honestly, I hadn't had a reason to even think about it for a long time. So it was cool seeing that cover and remembering. Oh my gosh, yeah, this was such a big part of my childhood. So we haven't mentioned the creatives behind the book, but David Michelinie is the writer, and I really hope that I'm saying that right. Mark Bagley is the primary penciler, although there are backup issues drawn by Ron Lim and the inker Sam De La Rosa, because unfortunately Mark Bagley got ill after issue 3 and wasn't able to resume the regular penciling duties. So, Joe, if you want to go ahead and break down some facts about David Michelinie.
Yeah, so David Michelinie, the most important fact is he is no slouch. He, behind Stan Lee and Dan Slott, had the longest run on Amazing Spider-Man. So if you've read a lot of Spider-Man, especially the older stuff from 1987 to 1994, you would be familiar with his name. If you haven't, you should read it because it's very good and there's a lot of it. So he also did a lot of other work that I wanted to run through just briefly. He worked on the Avengers from 78 to 82. He co-wrote and also wrote some Iron Man from 1978 to 1982, and again in 1987 to 1989. So he kind of took a little break and came back to it. But most notably, there were characters that he created or co created with others, such as Venom, Carnage, Scott Lang, Ant Man, Rhodey War Machine, and the Taskmaster. David Michelinie and artist Paul Ryan are the only comic book creators to have contributed to the wedding issues of both Peter Parker Spider Man to Mary Jane Watson in 87 and Superman Clark Kent marrying Lois Lane in 1996. He's also worked closely with John Byrne, whose name you hopefully recognize from our episode on Hellboy Seed of Destruction. If you have not listened to that yet, go back and listen to it, but wait until after we're done here because I'm still talking.
Don't
Michelinie,
interrupt me. It sickens me.
exactly. Michelinie's written for DC as well as Marvel. DC, he did Superman in Action Comics as well as Aquaman in Adventure Comics, which led to the revival of his own title in 1977. He also worked on a series called Karate Kid, which bears absolutely no resemblance to the Karate Kid movies from the 1980s, except that the people who were making the movies had to ask DC for permission to use the name, but the characters are not related. His career has so many ups and downs, twists and turns, so many characters. There's so many titles. We could probably just do an episode on that just by itself, but just kind of wanted to give a few highlights. And he has been involved with a lot of characters that we know and love today, especially the one named Venom, which is who we're here to talk about. So long career.
Yeah, it's there's a lot to him. I didn't realize that he had even worked at DC at all, and then knowing or finding out that he was involved in the wedding issue for Superman and Lois, that's a huge deal. So his
Hmm.
contribution to DC at least was very, very significant, even if it didn't last for a very long time. So I really didn't know much about him going into this. The Karate Kid thing is funny because I didn't learn that until 2 or 3 years ago. That Karate Kid was actually a character at DC before it was a movie, and that they had to pay them off about that. So that's a really funny little piece of trivia. Moving on, I guess we'll talk about Mark Bagley a little bit. So one of the cool things is, again, while I had kind of a personal memory related to first buying issue 1 of this story, I actually have briefly met Mark Bagley at a convention. And I think this is the first comic book creator that we've talked about on the podcast that I have actually talked to in person. So that's kind of cool. What is not cool is that I kind of have a habit of making an idiot of myself in front of these people because I
What?
get so excited. Yeah, I know that's shocking. I get so excited and my enthusiasm for the material takes over and I start stumbling over my words. So this was a specifically a Spider-Man panel that we're on, and there were a couple of other creators. The current writer of Carnage at the time, I believe it was Frank Thierry, but that may be incorrect. And also Nick Spencer, who is currently writing Amazing Spider-Man. They were also in on this panel. But they opened it up to the floor to have questions about anything Spider-Man related, anything going on at Marvel at the moment that they might be involved with. So I raised my hand and Mark Bagley called on me and I said, I haven't read a whole lot of your Spider-Man body of work, but I really loved your creation of and your era on the New Warriors. Would you be able to speak about that? And his immediate response was, so we just opened it up to the floor for Spider-Man questions, and you're asking me a question about the New Warriors? And I was like, yeah.
Oh,
And he goes, so you're not scared? And I was like, no. So meanwhile,
wow.
my little sister who's here at the con sitting next to me is completely mortified. Her face is turning red. But I just leaned into it and was like, no, I'm not ashamed. And he did graciously answer my question. He was like, I really enjoyed that era in the 90s. It was fun, kind of creating a counterpart to DC's Teen Titans and writing and penciling those characters like Nova and Night Thrasher and Speedball and some of those guys that are lesser known. He said it was just a really fun era. So that was kind of an awkward exchange, but I did actually get to speak to him a little bit. So
That's awesome.
um
When you're at a panel and you're like, "Hey, I want to hear, tell us about your time on Spider-Man and tell us about this and we love Spider-Man." And then somebody gets up and they're like, "Hey, I don't really care about Spider-Man. I want to ask about something unrelated." And you're like, "Oh, come on, man." but but no, that's awesome. Like, we all like comics, and if we're there to talk about comics, I mean, whether it's Spider-Man or not, it's like, especially if it's your opportunity to talk to somebody who's worked on that stuff. I mean, why not, right? You shouldn't have to be scared to ask a question like that. It's a funny story, though.
yeah, it was just a little bit awkward. It wasn't like some social experience that I'll never recover
You didn't get
from or
booed?
something like that. No.
Oh,
No,
that's good.
but certainly my sister was very embarrassed, and it is what it is. It seemed to go okay. So if we're actually to talk about the man's career itself, he, like I think several people that we've talked about, has a really interesting career trajectory where he started in the military in his early life. So he's got that in common with Tom King, who we talked about, in the Mr. Miracle episode. And then when he came back, he attended the Ringling College of Art and Design in Sarasota, Florida. So I don't know how close that is to you, Joe, but at least it's in the same state. And
It's a big state.
after multiple attempts, yeah, it is a big state. He was unable to break into the comics industry, so he worked construction after that, and unfortunately got an injury to his leg that was so severe that he needed 132 stitches, which just ended his construction career right there. So after that, he did end up landing an assignment where he was drawing, but he was doing technical drawings for Lockheed Martin, which is one of the biggest aerospace and arms defense contractors to supply, arms and related things to the United States military. So, and from what I've read, it looks like he was kind of content to stay there. It was a good paying job. It was very secure work, but a friend convinced him to send in submissions to Marvel's Tryout, which is a series that Jim Shooter was putting on at the time to basically give new talent a chance to break into the industry. And whoever, won this contest at the time was going to land a professional job with Marvel, but there was only going to be one person. So, again, your odds are not very good, but his buddy, I did some research. I wasn't able to find the name, but his buddy did convince Bagley to enter that, and he actually beat out all the other competitors to land that job working at Marvel. So actually pretty crazy, like one of those one in a million things where his talent was clear. The editors, or editor in chief at Marvel decided, yeah, we want to bring this guy on after that contest. So he primarily is known for penciling the Amazing Spider-Man series. So again, this is somebody that's very much steeped in that world. He's been linked with that character but he did co-create the New Warriors title with writer Fabian Nicieza, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We have a lot of very difficult names this time. Michelinie is another one that I'm just assuming we're saying it correctly. So Bagley also co-created Carnage with writer David Michelinie, of all people. So, and his work on the Maximum Carnage series is kind of what made him a massive star within comic books. So, Carnage is a very edgy character. He's very dark. This is the period in comic books where that stuff was really taking off, and there was kind of that attitude that the maybe some of the more traditional superheroes, having no kill codes and not being as extreme were maybe a little bit less relevant. The Spider-Man sales during the 90s certainly were not, the height of the book's popularity, except for those kind of symbiote related characters. So that was the stuff that was really, really becoming popular. It looks like he did also work at DC really briefly during the era when Dick Grayson was Batman. So that's when Grant Morrison was writing and Bruce Wayne was actually dead for a certain amount of continuity. So it looks like he did work at DC briefly, but the other really big highlight of Mark Bagley's career is he did 111 consecutive issues of Ultimate Spider-Man with Brian Michael Bendis, which marked the longest writer-artist collaboration in the history of comics, to my knowledge, at that point. I don't know if that still holds true, but I know at that point they were setting out to break the record that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had on Fantastic Four, which I think theirs was maybe 105, 106 issues, somewhere in that neighborhood. So that's just a really, really long time for two creators to work together, and especially without any break in the middle.
Yeah.
So that's just really impressive. So Michelini and Bagley, it sounds like, are really two people that have had the chance to really dig in, do long runs on things, and were really influential on shaping aspects of the Spider-Man universe, whether it's the Ultimate Spider-Man or the main canon universe. There are a couple of other artists that worked on this, but I don't really have a whole lot to say about them. Ron Lim did the backup issues 4 through 6 of Venom Lethal Protector. He's basically aping Bagley's style, and I think he did it well enough that it wasn't a jarring change. It doesn't feel like we switched directors in the middle of the story. It isn't quite as polished as Bagley's work, and I did notice that, but it's certainly not something that ruined the narrative or that was super distracting from it. So I just, the other couple of notes that I have about Mark Bagley is that he's gone on record as saying he doesn't like drawing Captain America, and there wasn't any really explanation there of why. I guess maybe that's just a hard character for him to capture, or he doesn't feel like he can do it justice for whatever reason. And he also does not enjoy crowd scenes, as he's been burned out on them, and he can't render them in a timely fashion. So
Yeah, me either.
well, anybody that's sat down to draw before, I'm not a professional artist. I'm definitely what would be considered an amateur, but just getting the anatomy correct on one figure, and the posing, and all of those aspects that will make it actually look like a person is hard enough. But to do it on the scale of an entire crowd is just something that's on another level. So I totally get why that's a huge chore to him. I do want to give him some really big points, because the 90s is when Jim Lee was taking off in the X-Men. Rob Liefeld was taking off. There are all these superstars, and they all had very similar styles. Mark Bagley definitely has a style that feels a little bit more restrained than either of those guys. It's not quite as over the top. It's recognizable, and it also is not imitating them, which is really impressive, because the lion's share of the artists in the 90s were trying to look like Jim Lee. I mean, those were the books that were just selling like hotcakes. And a lot of people have argued that Rob Liefeld ultimately is Jim Lee with a little bit less mastery of anatomy, which I don't know if that's entirely fair, but they're definitely influenced by each other, and Liefeld is definitely influenced by Lee. So Anyway, Bagley's stuff looks like Bagley's stuff. It doesn't look like anybody else's. So I do give him high points for that.
I think I remember reading there were a couple criticisms about this because the way that he drew Venom in this story, I think because they were going for the anti-hero angle, he didn't look quite as menacing and sharp as he had previously.
Well, for me personally, I like that it's a little bit restrained. The big artist that everybody thinks of when it comes to Venom is Todd McFarlane,
Yeah.
and his stuff is super duper detailed. I mean, it takes that to extreme excess. And well, I think that works for McFarlane, and it's very iconic, and it's very much the look that people associate with Venom. I do kind of like that this is pulled back a little bit more, and it's a little bit more of a realistic look, as realistic as an
Right.
alien monster attached to a human can look. Yeah, I don't know, but for the most part, I enjoyed the art in this. It's right before computer coloring entered the scene, so there's none of that. But I don't think that's anything that we can really fault the book for. It's just we were right on the cusp of that age, and so it's mostly going to be flat colors and kind of minimal shading, but that's not really anything to do with the penciler. So
The one thing that I did like better about Todd McFarlane's design actually was not on Venom, but on Eddie Brock. His hair specifically, it was a buzz cut, but in this, it's more of like a rocker punk kind of thing, and maybe it's just a product of the time period. But I read a couple of reviews online, and one person described it as business in the front and party in the back, and that's a pretty accurate description.
yeah, Eddie Brock basically has a mullet in this.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny. I mean, I don't remember the specific year that Death and Return of Superman happened, but I know that Superman came back with a pretty epic mullet after his death arc in the pages of Action and Superman. So I think it's something to do with the time period specifically. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if that looked very cool in the 90s and it just didn't age well, or what it was. My perception was that mullets were kind of going out in the 90s, that was more of an 80s thing. But I guess this is 93, so we're not too far away from that.
Right. It's not quite out of style, maybe just being phased out.
Mhm.
Well, at least they didn't do that to Peter Parker, because that's where I would have drawn the line.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think Peter Parker should ever be not like a clean shaven, kind of well presented dude.
No, he's not very hip. Back to Venom, though. Well, also for Eddie Brock, just kind of, I guess we can do a little introduction for Venom for those who maybe haven't read Venom or are just maybe more familiar with the movies and don't know his comic origin. Because usually in the movies you get more of a condensed version of, this is what you need to know basically to get the movie going. But I know a lot of fans were kind of disappointed over the movies because it wasn't connected to Spider-Man, which is how Venom originally got his start in the comics. So
Sure.
he was actually introduced by writer Jim Shooter and artist Mike Zeck as a living costume for Spider-Man in the early 1980s. So there was an event called Secret War, and this was the one from the 80s, not the more recent one from 2015. Spider-Man's costume is ruined from many battles that took place during the story. He goes to a vending machine, basically, that can read his thoughts and instantly fabricate any type of clothing. Seems like a pretty good idea, right? What could go wrong? Free clothing, great. So he chooses a machine. I think he picks the wrong one, or he gets wrong directions or something. But he essentially uses this machine and gets this black sphere, which spreads over his body and dissolves his old tattered costume and covers his body to form a new black and white costume. So to his surprise, it can also mimic street clothes and provide an inexhaustible and stronger supply of webbing. So, it saves him money and it's stylish and he doesn't have to buy any more clothes. I mean, great, I'll keep it. Sure, no questions
Seems
asked,
like there's no
problem.
downside.
Exactly. So after Secret War's over and Spider-Man gets back to his own book, in May of 1984, issue number 252, I did my research, thank you, writer Tom DeFalco and artist Ron Frenz took over and turned this living costume into an actual alien symbiote. And then 6 issues later, Spider-Man actually starts to get concerned because, it starts behaving kind of weird and he's waking up in the morning and finding himself in a different place than he was when he went to bed. So he goes to Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four to find out what's going on. And Richards does some tests, finds out that the suit's alive. Spider-Man freaks out, and they trap the symbiote in what looks like a science-y glass jar of some kind with super force fields and something.
Yeah, it's got unstable molecules. That's his answer to everything. So,
Yeah, there you go. Of course, it doesn't work because he escapes later. But anyway,
ah.
this is actually, I think, very notable because it's also the first appearance of the bombastic bagman, which is Spider-Man in a Fantastic Four costume with a paper bag over his head. Since the symbiote was his suit and his clothing, he couldn't exactly walk around naked, so they had to give him something to wear so that way he doesn't expose his secret identity. And so if you've played the Spider-Man game on PS4, you may have noticed a weird-looking costume for Spider-Man where he's wearing a Fantastic Four costume with a paper bag on his head. That's the bombastic bagman, and that's where he came from. It was a Venom storyline, so there you go. All right, so like I said, the symbiote escapes. I don't really think we know how, but it finds a way to escape. It tries to rebond with Peter Parker. He is not happy about this, so he flees to a cathedral, and that's where he actually finds out that the symbiote can be injured by sound waves from the church bell. So this is kind of similar to the story in the animated series from 1990, where he's at a church bell ringing really loud, and that's what splits him from the symbiote. And then the symbiote flees to find Eddie Brock, who is, super mad at Spider-Man, and they kind of share this hatred together, and that's sort of what creates their bond. It's interesting though because in the comics there's this short little scene where Parker gets knocked unconscious, and I guess his life is in danger sitting there on the top of this cathedral with the bell ringing super loud. I don't know, but the symbiote drags him to safety before it leaves. And it's really strange because why did it do that? Especially when it's going to bond to Brock and hate Spider-Man and want to kill him. Why did it save his life? And Peter, I think, even makes the comment like, I'll probably never know why he did that, which was kind of
Huh.
interesting.
That's something I didn't know. That Venom basically has two weaknesses, right? Is he like fire damages his bonds to the host, and then also sound waves
Yep.
are kind of the other big weakness.
Yeah, I think if he would have found that out, it probably would have been harder to get the symbiote off of him with fire without, hurting himself. So the sound was probably a safer choice.
Yeah.
So anyway, Eddie Brock, he was a Daily Globe reporter, and he published an article about the identity of this serial killer that was known as Sin Eater. But unfortunately, the person that confessed to the crimes was actually a compulsive liar, and Spider-Man actually caught the real killer, and there was this huge expose on how Brock was a fraud and he had caught the wrong guy. So that totally ruined his career. After that, he could only get jobs for venomous tabloids and blame Spider-Man for his predicament. So, of course, he called himself Venom because he was tired of working at venomous tabloids. It makes a lot of sense. Actually, there were a couple other names for Venom that they came up with, and I can't remember because I didn't write them down, but there were a couple other names that they had before they settled on Venom.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So Brock, he took up bodybuilding because he wanted to reduce stress, but it didn't work and he sank into a suicidal depression. So he was seeking solace at the cathedral where Spider-Man was trying to get the symbiote off of him and trying to, figure out what to do. And that's when the symbiote, sensing his hatred for Spider-Man, bonded with him. And then they took on the name Venom in reference to the sensationalistic material he was forced to traffic in following his fall from grace. So, like I said, the Spider-Man animated series did a pretty good job of kind of putting all of that in an animated form, which was really cool to see. So, if you haven't, maybe YouTube a couple clips or something, because it's neat to see that come to life in that fashion and honor the comic version that
Yeah,
way.
from what I remember, they tinkered with the origin of how the symbiote came to Earth a little bit.
Yeah,
Because it didn't come out of this big crossover Marvel event. But I think it was J. Jonah Jameson's son actually brought it back on a space shuttle or something like that. But the funny thing is mostly when I talk to people that are Spider-Man fans but kind of non-comic readers, they assume that that is the origin of Venom, that that is where he came from. But it's obviously, as with most comic books, it's always more complicated than that.
Well,
So
and just like comic books love to do, there's a lot of retcons and things that happen anyway. So you kind of have to take everything with a grain of salt when you see a retelling of something, even if it's in a different media form, because it may just make more sense at the time, or just as times change. Now we can say, hey, William Shatner brought something back with him instead, and that can be something. And maybe Venom will talk like Captain Kirk. Who knows? But
man, I certainly hope not. I love William Shatner.
yeah, right. So there's some additional telling that they've done for Venom, and it starts to get really complicated. But basically, the Venom symbiote is the 998th of its lineage, and it was spawned at some point during the reign of the Dark Elder God Null. So there's this whole like kind of celestial background because he's an alien, so he's got to come from somewhere, right? But they actually give the symbiote race a name, and if I'm pronouncing this correctly, it's like Clintar. Starts with a K.
Wow. I did not know that they'd ever defined that.
Yeah, there's this whole thing about like the Kree and the Skrulls and Battle World and the Beyonder and like all this background that goes into the symbiotes in general and sort of Venom's true origin from the stars. So it's kind of interesting. It's out there if you want to look more into it, but really, Venom, apart from either Spider-Man or Eddie or Flash Thompson or whoever he might be bonded with, that's the fun part is the actual symbiosis. But they did try to explain where the alien itself came from.
Sure, and I think that whatever he's bonding with or whoever he's bonding with changes what the combined personality is a little bit, right? Is that,
Yeah.
am I accurate in saying that? Okay.
Yeah, and it's like the symbiote takes on the characteristics of the host, and then the next person that he goes to, he kind of brings all those characteristics to him. So like when Venom bonds with Brock, he brings those qualities that he had from Spider-Man, such as the heightened strength and the web fluid that he can just make kind of out of nowhere that fortunately comes out of his hands than anywhere else. Um,
It's not scientifically accurate.
yeah, well, that's a good thing. But since Brock is, well, they describe him at one point as having Olympic level strength, which seems like a little too far. But he did work out a lot. He did get very strong, and he looks really ripped in the comics. So we just know that he's really strong. But somehow that, in combination with the strength that Venom got from Spider-Man, actually makes him a little bit stronger than Spider-Man is on his own.
Really? I don't know that I realized that, especially because I know that very early on in Marvel continuity, Stan Lee was definitely holding up Spider-Man as like this is like, the third or fourth strongest person in the entire universe. So
Yeah. Well, and he's
that's
young, so who
that's
knows
almost
when he gets older how strong he'll be.
yeah, that's almost disappointing that they would have Venom one up him, but the 90s was all about, we got to do everything bigger and better and louder and
Right.
fiercer than we did before. So
Well, and
that
of
makes
course,
sense.
this podcast episode isn't about Carnage, but you kind of can't talk about symbiotes without talking about Carnage. But Carnage is actually stronger, I think, than Venom and Spider-Man put together, is
Whoa.
what I read. And then he doesn't, it's one of the two. I think he's not as susceptible to sound, but he's more susceptible to fire. So kind of like a trade-off there.
Huh.
So
Well, the
all
movie's got that wrong.
right, yeah. So all the symbiotes have kind of different qualities, but I mean, it was spawned from Venom, who was getting stronger as he went on. So I guess it makes sense that his spawn would be even stronger. I don't know.
Yeah, I
At
don't
least in
know.
this comic, nobody got bitten.
Yeah, I don't think that's a thing. But I mean, speaking of things that aren't a thing, Venom does not eat brains in this comic,
Thank
nor
goodness.
did he before. That's something in the movie, and I've been told by a friend of mine, actually the work buddy I have, Daniel, that let me borrow the trade so that I could read this. he said that there is a later story called Venom the Hunger where I think some of that does happen. So they may not have pulled it out of nowhere, but to me, that's kind of a hacky thing to add to the character, and it's not really
Yeah.
necessary. So
So I guess, we've talked a lot about kind of the origins and the writer and artists and our personal experiences, but I guess we should probably talk about this particular miniseries and, talk about the story a little bit.
sure. Well, I mean, the interesting thing is because he had become so popular, Venom Lethal Protector is essentially setting up Eddie Brock to now become an anti-hero as opposed to being a straight up villain. So this signifies a really big shift in that character away from him just being the guy that hates Spider-Man and wants to kill him. And I don't know how organically that was done outside the pages of this book, but for the purposes of this story, when we start out, it seems like he and Spider-Man have kind of come to an agreement that they're going to stay out of each other's hair.
Yeah. Like you don't talk to me, I won't talk to you, and then Eddie moves to San Francisco to, distance himself, which seems like a great idea until Spider-Man reads that, oh, Venom's, stirring some stuff up in San Francisco. Well, I better go interfere. Like, dude, what? Leave him alone.
Well, that's something we can talk about as we get into it. But Spider-Man, in a lot of ways, sabotages Brock's life and honestly makes a lot of what happens in this story more difficult than it needs to be. So you could almost argue that Spider-Man is kind of a minor villain in Eddie Brock's story. So it is
Wow.
really interesting to see it from that side, because this comic is very much presented from Eddie Brock's point of view. So
Yeah, so you really start to learn kind of more about Eddie, and they give him a little bit of a background. Like he has a father who lives in San Francisco who's apparently pretty rich, and he has sort of done that isolation thing, hasn't really been emotionally available, so it's kind of made Eddie turn into, this kind of person who's very distant and doesn't want to relate to people. And so it goes along with the symbiote being an alien and also having its desires to either eat people or just cause mayhem. So they give him this backstory to kind of show, to humanize him a little bit, and then also give him a mission of something to do in this story that you can kind of start to see where he's turning away from, okay, I'm just going to cause all these issues, to where, okay, I don't have Spider-Man here to deal with, so what do I want to do on my own? Well, I want to protect innocence, because that's kind of Venom's thing, is he wants to protect innocence. So they go about it in their own way where they protect an innocent, and then they kill the guy who's trying to go after someone who's innocent, and like that's what you're supposed to do. Why wouldn't you do it that way? And that's really the anti-hero MO is, they do heroic deeds, but the way they go about it or what they do to, and we're not talking like villains that are trying to kill, millions of people and you don't really have another choice. And that's it's not like a moral question. It's literally a mugger on the street who's trying to get a purse from some lady. He stops the mugging, which is great, but then he kills the guy who's trying to do the mugging. Like, okay, maybe that's a little too much, too far.
well, it's almost worse than he just kills him, because doesn't he like shove the symbiote goo down the guy's throat until he suffocates to death?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty horrible way to go out. I would think that would take mugging down to an all-time low in San Francisco, though. I mean, once word gets around about that, like I'm definitely not trying to take anybody's purse. So, and this is really just, it's so much a product of its time. I mean, we've got Image Comics is just starting around this time, and they're doing a lot of really extreme stuff over there. Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, all those guys are kind of leaning into that, pushing against the Comics Code Authority or abandoning it entirely so that they can, show more violence, have more adult themes. And in some ways, the genre of comic books was growing up to being a more adult medium, but in other ways, that freedom that they were they were pushing for allowed them to be more immature, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
I
it was a kind of a double-edged sword.
I think you're right though that it would definitely have an impact on crime in the city, especially a lot more than, getting a piece of paper that says your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
Yeah, yeah, like okay, if Spider-Man catches me and webs me up, it's like, yeah, that sucks because I hung from a lamppost for 3 hours before the police showed up. But
Right.
it's not as bad as like hearing. Did you hear about Jake over there? He tried to steal a lady's purse and he got suffocated to death. Like that's pretty bad.
From some alien goo with fangs and claws. Like, I don't even want to go outside, let alone think about stealing or vandalizing or whatever.
Yeah, well, and there is a little bit of humor in it. I mean, one of the things I do enjoy about this book is that it doesn't entirely take itself seriously. Venom is kind of smiling with these terrifying teeth and handing the purse back to the lady, and you can tell she's just like completely mortified of him. And I do like that like he's rescuing people, but they're also like they just can't wait for him to leave, you know?
Yeah. He's not exactly the most pleasant to look at, but I think that's
No.
so. As far as our story goes, it's kind of strange because it really doesn't have much to do with Venom or Eddie or anything. It feels like kind of a, well, we can get to this in the review section, but essentially there's this story point about a secret society of people living in an underground city that fell beneath the earth in the early 1900s. Venom ends up protecting them from a guy named Roland Treese, who is a shady businessman and CEO of Treese International, and they are bent on destroying this underground town to get rich off of some gold that apparently is buried beneath it, and he knows this somehow. If you recognize the name from the Venom movie, he's a mercenary for hire who retrieves Eddie to take the Venom symbiote, but gets his head bitten off by Venom when the symbiote bonds with Eddie's girlfriend, and they temporarily become some sort of she Venom. So he had a very unfortunate ending in the movie, but in this, he is a very successful and shady businessman.
Well, Treese is, yeah, I was going to say he's kind of a slime ball. So,
Yeah, he's a
in
slime
fact,
ball.
he has really no redeeming qualities whatsoever. In this, it's all about I'm going to get rich, and if there are people underneath the area that I need to level to get to that gold, I don't really care. It is interesting. It's almost like the Morlocks, who are a mutant society that live underground because they've kind of been outcast. And obviously they take their name from the Morlocks from the Time Machine by H.G. Wells. But yeah, these are sort of like underdwellers or people that live in the sewer that are they're essentially a homeless population, but they found these buildings that were sunk, in this turn of the century earthquake, and somehow those buildings are just fine, and I guess they're safe to live in. I mean,
Sure.
I wouldn't want to do it, but for the purposes of the comic, they're totally okay. It was a little bit silly. There are some things that don't need to be explained, but comic book logic, sometimes they go into it. Apparently, the reason that there is gold buried under this site is because in the early 1900s, a foreign power financed anarchists in the United States by giving them tons of bars of gold, and they buried it under the ground, but they didn't count on the earthquake of
Um,
1905. So the gold got buried, and then they just gave up. I guess I don't know. I just thought that was that was a bit of a stretch to be like, why was it that complicated? But
Right. And
yeah,
then Treese is
yeah.
just kind of hoping that I guess the story is true. I don't know that he necessarily would have any proof of that unless the anarchists were part of his group or the group that, would become his, I guess, later. But
Maybe they're all in the Illuminati together. I don't know, and they pass down records.
I suppose so. That does sound like the Life Foundation a little bit. So if you see in the movies, the name Life Foundation is there. They're basically a survivalist group dedicated creating a futuristic utopian society that could withstand an apocalyptic event. So for the low price of only $5 million, you can reserve your own spot. So obviously, society's elite are the ones who are doing this, and they don't care about anybody else.
Yeah, it's almost like a Bond villain setup of like I'm gonna drop this chunk of earth on homeless people, but it works within the confines of this story. And honestly, we've got alien symbiotes running around, saving people. So it's one of the least fantastical things in the book. So it doesn't really bother me too much.
Yeah.
I did want to mention, in the first issue, at least before I had read this, my perception of Eddie Brock was always that he was kind of a meathead, that he was kind of just a dumb jock, and that he just let hatred consume him. And I didn't really see him as a very three-dimensional character, but they established very early that he does have a moral compass. He does have a sense of right and wrong, and he sees these homeless people that are being attacked by giant robots. And I mean, that's something you're only going to find in comic books. So, you guys should definitely read comics. But he sees that, and he immediately is like, I need to defend these people. And so, he venoms up and goes and saves them from the robots. And I don't know, I think they do a good job of establishing very early that he actually does care about people. He's not just this dumb guy that's trying to get rich quick with sensational pictures or something like that. I mean, there is depth to him. And even later in the story, they go into his past and kind of establish that his father was maybe not physically abusive in the traditional sense. It's not like what you see in most movies where he's, like pounding down beers and then beating his kid up. But it was more that he was just emotionally negligent and distant. And that resulted a lot in how Eddie is constantly trying to prove himself, and the with the bodybuilding and being having Olympic level strength, or being a journalist that's making it big, whatever the thing is. It's like he's got that aspect to him that he's trying to please his father. So I did enjoy how Michelinie added some layers to him that made me empathize with him a little bit. I still may not necessarily think that it's okay for him to just be killing muggers on the street, but his intentions are good, and he's definitely not somebody that is just a shade of black. He's completely a villain. He's evil. There's some gray there, and you see how there could be some room in San Francisco for somebody like this, where what he's doing might actually be necessary. So
I think that's a difference between this and the movie version where, especially in the most recent movie, he's shouting lethal protector, like every 2 seconds. But
uh,
he really has a strong sense of protecting innocence, and he will go out of his way to do that. He's not, I mean, here originally I don't think was really even a villain. It was more just, he hated Spider-Man for everything that he did to him, like both him and him, like Eddie and Venom. So it was just that fueled him to have this rivalry, I guess, with Spider-Man, and that was the driving force behind what he was doing. So there were a lot of complaints about the movie that Spider-Man wasn't in it, but especially after reading this, I feel like it was almost better not to have Spider-Man, because then the character could stand on its own. He could have his own qualities, but at the same time, like, where did he get the webbing from and everything? I guess he doesn't have it in the movie, but there are certain things that you kind of have to have that origin to know where they came from. So, but anyway, so I guess I just am trying to say, like, this, he gets to stand alone as more of a character on his own, be a little more fleshed out, and have a direction to go that's more than just, oh, I hate Spider-Man, kind of like a cheesy mustache twirling villain. Like, my fuel is to try to think up ways to kill Spider-Man every day. Well, no, he's coming into his own. He's deciding how he wants to do things, as well as, what he wants to do. And
yeah,
that's what makes this enjoyable.
yeah. I mean, I don't think he was ever the guy that was walking into a room and murdering a dozen people just for kicks. It
Right.
was really just that vendetta he had with Peter Parker. And Carnage is that guy that's going to go into a room with the symbiote and just slaughter people for no reason. But he was a serial killer before the symbiote bonded with him, so he
Exactly.
was already a dirtbag. And I think if the movies really fail in something, and this story really highlights it, it's that you do get the sense that Eddie is kind of a dirtbag in the movies, especially the most recent one. It just doesn't feel like he really cares. He's just kind of letting his own life end up in shambles and is acting like none of it matters, and that isn't really even resolved within Let There Be Carnage. But here you really do get the sense that he's coming to his own. He's doing what he can to move on. He may be making some choices with his superheroing that maybe we wouldn't make, and he definitely doesn't have a no kill code, but he's trying to be on the up and up, and I think that goes a long way.
Yeah. So in this story, he wants to protect the sort of underground civilization from Treese, who's trying to get all of that gold and is going to do it by any means necessary. So unlike James Bond, Eddie's not very subtle. And but that's a good thing, I guess, because Treese, as Mike mentioned earlier, has these giant robots called diggers, and I'm not sure really why or why they decided to introduce giant robots, but that's what's in this story, and that's
Because comic books.
yeah, I guess. But that's what Venom ends up fighting for the most part. But it's interesting because there's a lot of different twists and turns in this story, and I'm not sure if it's that way on purpose or if it's just meant to add more layers, but it feels a little disjointed, I think, at times where we're talking about Eddie working in his backstory, then we're seeing what he's doing now, and then we have Treese in there, but then we have Carlton Drake and the Life Foundation, and they have an even more sinister plot, and then we have Spider-Man jumping in the mix and mucking things up as well. So there's a lot of elements going on in the story at the same time.
Well, and there's also the subplot in here about, I guess there was a prison guard that Venom killed when he was escaping prison, and his
Oh, yeah.
father has come with this vendetta against Venom. And there's actually a moment where Venom's like, well, I had to defend myself, but his grief is legitimate. And I did not expect that kind of depth from him, to be like, well, yeah, that's a genuine gripe. Like, maybe I shouldn't have just killed that guy. And I don't know, that really surprised me. Honestly, that story beat, I think they should have blown that up into the big antagonist for this trade instead of Treese and the Life Foundation, because their stuff about dropping the city on the homeless and getting the gold is way less interesting to me than that having some kind of like a moral quandary for Venom to deal with. But they don't really dwell on that too much.
Yeah, especially in a book where you're trying to differentiate him and bring him into his own and add some backstory. It seems like it would have been good to focus more on that instead of some of these strange comic book plots. So if this were a movie, I would say the studio maybe interfered, but I don't think that's the case since this is a comic book.
Yeah. I will say that it's honestly has more substance to it than what I expected, because just knowing what era it is and knowing that Venom is one of those characters associated with people just buying the cover because it looks cool, which, I mean, let's be honest, when we're kids, that's really all it takes. Is you go in, you see a cool cover, and you're like, all right, I'll spend $2 on that. Or prices unfortunately have gone way up since then. But when I was a kid, that was all it needed. I mean, the very few Spider-Man issues that I owned would have been very much that, where I just looked at the art and I was like, wow, that looks amazing. I'm gonna buy that and see what's inside those pages. So going into this, I think my expectations were low, and to get all this depth about his father and sort of learn who Eddie Brock is as a character and actually start to care about him really surprised me. So even though I think the narrative itself kind of jumps all over the place, I definitely give them points for making Eddie Brock himself feel more like a real person.
Right. Well, and in this story as well, to add complications to matters, there's not just those stories, but there's also the Life Foundation is experimenting with seeds that they've extracted from Venom and creating additional symbiotes. So now we have other people who have symbiotes bonded with them who are now fighting Venom and Spider-Man. So that kind of leads to like a little mini team up, which I guess is good for the overall story because it helps resolve it at the end. But again, it's another plot twist or just additional element to the story that it's like, okay, what story are we trying to tell here? Because there's so many things going on, and this doesn't really relate to the gold and the underground dwellers and what's happening to them while we're dealing with this.
Well, and at every point in the story, up until the new symbiotes that have been created are revealed, Spider-Man has just been hounding Venom at every turn. I mean, he's just like, yeah, I know that we said we'd leave each other alone, but you're a killer, and I don't think I should, just leave you by yourself. Apparently, you killed this mugger, and I will say that there's a surprisingly low body count for Venom, though, especially for a 1990s comic where we've got characters like the Punisher that are, becoming very prominent and popular. And I mean, at least what was going on culturally, we're a decade into the war on crime and the war on drugs, and wanting to see politicians be very, very tough on offenders and things like that. That was kind of the prevailing notion of the day. So, but there are several guys that are able to leap out of machines before Venom destroys them. Not all. I mean, there are some kills in there. I was actually surprised at how restrained it was in that regard, because he doesn't just indiscriminately kill people, and I was expecting him to. So yeah, I don't know. It just kind of goes back to that. I felt like Spider-Man was getting in his way more often than not, and almost his inability to forgive him or get over the previous vendetta seemed to be holding him back from seeing that Eddie was doing a little bit of good too. So it's kind of an interesting push and pull. And for my part, I'm more comfortable seeing Spider-Man team up with Venom towards the end of this story than I am seeing Spider-Man ever team up with the Punisher. I just, to me, Peter Parker should not be able to reconcile what Frank Castle's doing is okay. Yes, Frank Castle kills the worst of the worst, but he will blow away an entire room full of gangsters without a second thought. And I just think that the death toll that Frank Castle, the Punisher, has is much, much worse than what Venom does.
Yeah, and he's willing to kill anybody who's there involved with it. Like, oh, you're connected, so it's okay.
Right.
Whereas,
Yeah.
even Venom's like, well, I'm going after the actual bad guys who are actually doing things. So,
Sure. Well, and he seems to have some sense of remorse, because again, he does question, like, maybe I shouldn't have killed that prison guard. And there he has a line where he's fighting cops at one point where he's like, I can't kill them, they're just doing their jobs, or
right.
something like that. So you see where he's a little bit closer in his moral alignment maybe to where Peter is than maybe Peter would acknowledge. And I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into those tiny moments in the story, but I bought it when they teamed up. I thought, yeah, they've reached the point where they don't really have as much animosity between them maybe, and Brock is trying to move on. Maybe it makes sense for them to take down these new symbiotes together.
Yeah, I think that's another, maybe the symbiote passed it on when it was bonded to Peter Parker, took on some of those morals, and has brought that with him in conjunction with, wanting to protect the innocents. And then Eddie Brock, who's not a bad guy, he's definitely not a serial killer, but it's just an amalgamation of all of these different thoughts and ideas that I think are forming a new character, which I guess that's what symbiosis is about. So
Sure.
I
He's a
think it,
Trill.
yeah, exactly.
He's bringing all the previous memories from the previous hosts, and the knowledge that the symbiote has, and
Oh, that would have been
combining it into
frightening.
this new
Every dark secret
personality.
and
Yeah,
every
it
thought
would
and
be
every
frightening.
worry that Parker has. He comes back to his apartment and there's Venom, talking to Mary Jane. Actually, that does happen, but he scares her and leaves, but they're not friends
Yeah,
at
but they
all.
needed that scene because Mary Jane has those sweet, sweet leg warmers on.
Oh, yeah. She is very trendy, very fashionable.
She is. That's, I mean, to their credit, that is actually a character trait that she has in the comic book. So it's not just she's drawn that way. Like that's part of her
Right.
character.
Yeah.
I did want to mention that there's a fair amount of humor in it, and so if I had to look at the movies, I would say that the first Venom movie had a decent amount of humor, but I don't think it overwhelmed it. Let There Be Carnage, it overwhelms the movie. There's too
Oh,
much.
yeah.
This comic book has just enough. I think where some of Spider-Man's quips weren't as hilarious to me as maybe some other writers would do. Although I did actually laugh out loud when there's one point where Spider-Man's looking for Eddie and a nearby window explodes and he says, "Ah, a clue," and that cracks me up a little bit. Venom has some comments. He kind of comments on his own dialogue at a couple points where he says being melodramatic gives me a tingle or something like that later. So the tone of the comic book is not entirely serious, and I do enjoy that about it. It's not afraid to be silly and have giant robots fighting homeless people, but at the same time they're gonna call attention to that and be like, we know this is ridiculous, but just bear with us. So
Yeah.
but I do think that it was a good sort of freshman effort of Venom on his own. I buy that he can survive as a solo character, and it was fun to see him in San Francisco sort of coming into his own, developing a little bit more depth, and even taking down a villain with Spider-Man. And I think they do end up deciding once again to just kind of stay out of each other's hair. At the end of the story, Parker maybe decides that he's misjudged Brock, or maybe not misjudged him, but he's judged him a little bit too harshly, where it's like, well, clearly he's defending these homeless people. He's stopping the Life Foundation and this mega corporation from crushing the disenfranchised. And they end the story with Brock actually ending up being able to join this society underground because he doesn't have anywhere to live. And so, maybe he's not living in the most glamorous place, but he's found a place to belong. And you do get the sense that his adventures in San Francisco from now on can move into, a little bit more stable environment for Eddie. So I don't know. It has for the most part, a satisfying ending, I think.
Yeah, I think Spider-Man had the Flash syndrome from the CW where he'd be like, "Oh, this is my problem. I need to clean it up. I need to do something about it. It's my problem." And so he goes trying to here Venom goes off the rails again, but like you said, Spider-Man learns about who Venom is becoming, and I think that's a good endorsement in this story because then you have subsequent stories now where you can see Venom, whether it's Eddie or somebody else, as more of the anti-hero and take away those qualities that we get from this story. So I think it was at a pivotal time and we got a lot of information and it took the character in a totally different direction than just being either a living suit or somebody who is just all about getting back at Spider-Man for revenge.
Sure. And for my part, I do enjoy this sort of trope in comic books of the reformed villain. It is much more rare, I think, to see a hero switch sides. I know there are a couple that have done that at DC. Red Hood is the anti-hero character that comes to my mind first and foremost because he does actually kill criminals, but he went from being a hero to an anti-hero. So I guess that's different than being a villain and becoming a hero. But it is interesting. It is, it's always good to see character arcs and character growth. And I think that while the narrative of this feels cluttered, the character work is well implemented. And I think that puts it in a place where I'm happier with it. Whereas what we read last week was really heavy on the narrative, and then there was almost none of the character stuff. And that really pulled it down for me. I think that even though this narrative is needlessly complex and there's way too many subplots and threads going on, the character stuff will sort of anchor you to it emotionally enough that that's not going to bother you quite so much. So at least that's my take on it.
Well, let me ask you a question. If you had 5 bananas, how many of them would you give to Venom Lethal Protector?
So I had to think about this for a while. And I think what I've landed on is a 3.5. And the reason is partially based on previous ratings we've given. I gave a 4 to Fables, I gave a 4 to Hellboy, Seed of Destruction. And I think this is maybe just slightly below their level of quality, where the ideas are just not quite as fleshed out as those two trades that we read. However, it's better than just a flat 3 because they did make me care about a character that I really didn't care about before. And they made me invested in it enough that I would honestly be interested to read more and go on. So it's going to be 3.5 bananas out of 5 for me. And honestly, the art, while it isn't anything that wowed me, I do know that it's very indicative of art of the era, but I really do give Bagley points for having a unique style, sticking to it, and not aping the really popular style of the day. So I am kind of grading it up for that as well. So yeah, I think that's where I land on it. It's a 3.5. It's definitely worth reading if you're into Spider-Man and you're looking to getting outside of just reading his mainline books and you're maybe interested in some of the side characters. It's not something that I would say if you're into Spider-Man, you just must read this, but it's definitely enjoyable. And if you have an interest in Venom, I think it's going to make you happy. So what do you think, Joe?
Well, I am a Spider-Man fanboy, so it's Spider-Man related. I give it a 5 out of 5. Thank you. Episode done. Goodbye. No, I'm just kidding.
Whoa.
No, so this was hard for me as well, and especially I did a lot of research and just looking at other opinions as well, because especially with something that I hate to say it, but is this old? When it came
Sure.
out, it was probably received a lot differently than it's being received by us reading it right now in 2021, especially with two
Mhm.
Venom movies under our belt and however many Spider-Man appearances and movies and cameos at this point. So I think I'm pretty close to your rating. I was actually debating on somewhere between a 3 and a 4. I was hoping that you would pick 4 so that way I could rate it down and give it a 3, but you went right in the middle.
That's where I'm at. I'm right in the middle
No,
on
it,
that.
it makes sense. But I kept going back and forth because we sort of knocked it a little bit. There's just a lot of disjointed story elements, and I kind of feel like the writer that we have on this should really have been able to have more of a cohesive story, especially with his background and everything that he's gone through with these characters. And it really felt like Spider-Man was just kind of thrown in there, and it was actually kind of annoying. Like I almost didn't
Yeah.
want to see Spider-Man in this because I wanted to read about Venom and see what he was doing. And just with all the different plots jumping in, actually it was just jarring to
It
go
was hard to
from
track.
yeah,
Yeah.
from
Yeah. It was
from
hard to
one
track everything.
one antagonist to the next for Venom of what's going on. Like, oh, you killed my son. Oh, I want this gold. Oh, I want to make some more symbiotes. Like, okay, wait, what book am I reading? I'm confused. Did I get the wrong issue in here in the middle somehow? So I think we've rated a lot of things higher than we would have if we were just reading it because of what it did for comics or for that character in general. And that's the
Sure.
hard part for me is I want to say, what this did for Venom, I feel like it should be a 4 out of 5. But judging it now at this time, kind of reading it, I'm just thinking there's too many elements that seem like they should have been a lot better. So I would settle more on a 3 out of 5. And like you said,
Okay.
it's good. It's definitely worth reading for a lot of the elements that are in it. But I guess if you do pick it up and read it, don't let us color your opinion, but just be aware that there's some disjointed events that happen in there and take that with a grain of salt. But I agree
Yeah.
with you that what it added to Venom was definitely needed and it was a good step.
Yeah, it's just really that unfocused narrative. That's really the biggest problem with it. If they could have eliminated, honestly, cut Spider-Man out of the book, and I don't think it drastically changes. Really, the climax where he has to fight all the other symbiotes would be the only part where the writer would have to figure out how to get Brock through that. But I think a good writer could find a different way to conclude that. And yeah, I think I'd have to agree with you. I don't know that I was annoyed at Spider-Man's appearance, but it definitely felt like he was intruding upon somebody else's story, and that alone begs the question of maybe should he have been there?
Or was he there just to get it more popular?
Yeah, well, I mean, sales are obviously a factor, and Spider-Man is,
Right.
as everybody knows, that's the top selling character at Marvel. So yeah, I think that's gonna probably just about do it for Venom Lethal Protector. We are planning on doing a trilogy of Spider-Man or Spider-Man related reviews coming up. Like I said, we're going to be staying at the big two for a while. So, from what I understand, we're going to be looking at Spider-Man: Edge of the Spider-Verse next,
Yes.
which is much more recent. This is from 2015, and I think that's going to be a really interesting one for you guys. So, thanks everybody for listening, and look forward to catching up next time.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll talk to you later.
Comic books, comic books, comics.
Comic book podcast. Comics.
Because they have no home.
Peace out.
Peace out.